Welcome back, folks. You're watching Fatal Files. Today I've pulled up several cases of some of the deadliest and most brutal outdoor deaths you'll ever see. From a man's fishing day turned into a violent tug-of-war with two alligators, to a man who trusted every stroke of his paddle until the water swallowed him whole in the most unimaginable way. August 12, 2017. Southern Florida was already heating up by mid-morning. Along a remote stretch of river, the water moved slowly past tall grass and thick vegetation. It was the kind of place locals knew about. Quiet, peaceful, and usually empty. And for Benjamin Turner, that was exactly the point. He was 42 years old and worked as a warehouse supervisor. Most of his week was spent indoors dealing with schedules, deliveries, and long shifts. Fishing was his way of slowing things down. I don't fish myself very often, but I understand why people love it. After spending all week around noise and deadlines, a quiet stretch of river actually sounds pretty good. That Saturday, he headed out alone with a truck full of gear and no real schedule to follow. Just a few hours by the water, maybe a decent catch, then home before dark. Benjamin parked near the river shortly after sunrise. He carried a folding chair, a small cooler, and two fishing rods down to the bank. Over the next few hours, he moved between different sections of shoreline, stopping wherever the fishing looked promising. Turtles occasionally surfaced near the reeds, wading birds picked through the shallows, and fish broke the surface from time to time. Visibility into the water wasn't especially good. Mud, vegetation, and shadows hid most of what was happening beneath the surface. Benjamin caught several fish throughout the morning and spent long stretches sitting quietly with a line in the water. As noon approached, temperatures climbed into the low 90s. The air became heavier, and even the breeze seemed to disappear. Eventually, Benjamin settled near a low section of bank where the grass met the water almost directly. There wasn't much separation between land and river there, just a narrow strip of mud and vegetation. At some point after noon, he hooked another fish. Benjamin reeled it toward the bank and crouched near the water. He leaned forward to deal with the line and the fish at his feet. Fishing has a way of narrowing your focus. Once a fish is at the bank, you're usually looking at the line, the hook, and the fish itself, not much else. The water beside him showed no obvious movement. Then, something burst out of the river. A large alligator lunged from the water and clamped onto Benjamin's lower leg. The force knocked him off balance almost immediately. Across the river, two fishermen were several hundred yards away when they heard shouting and splashing. One later reported seeing what appeared to be a large alligator thrashing near the shoreline before the disturbance moved into the water. Due to the distance and thick vegetation, neither witness could clearly see what happened. The struggle moved across the shoreline. Mud and vegetation were torn up as Benjamin fought to stay on land. His fishing rod was thrown aside. The tackle box overturned. Pieces of gear ended up scattered across the bank. For several moments, the fight remained near the shoreline. Then, the alligator began pulling him closer to the water. As the struggle continued, a second large alligator approached from deeper in the river, drawn by the commotion. The disturbance near the shoreline intensified as both animals converged on the same area, making it even harder for Benjamin to remain on land. As the encounter continued near the water's edge, investigators determined that a second alligator became involved in the attack. Evidence recovered from the scene and witness statements supported the conclusion that two alligators were present during the incident. Severe injuries occurred during the encounter, and blood loss became significant. At some point, survival was no longer possible. Searchers began examining the riverbank and quickly found additional evidence. Blood was present near the shoreline, and drag marks led from the bank toward the water before disappearing. Benjamin's remains were eventually recovered during the search. The examination concluded that he died from traumatic injuries and blood loss sustained during an alligator attack. Bite patterns on the lower leg and upper body, damage to clothing, physical evidence along the shoreline, and marks found near the water all pointed to the same conclusion, consistent with two separate animals. With no indication of any other factors, the case was closed as an accidental wildlife death. It was June 23, 2017. About 18 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, a small boat drifted above a reef system known for attracting large fish. The weather cooperated that day. The water was relatively calm, visibility was good, and conditions were favorable for diving. Emily Rhodes was 36 years old and had spent years diving recreationally. Spearfishing had become one of her favorite ways to spend time outdoors, combining diving with the challenge of tracking fish underwater. On June 23rd, she joined a group of friends for a trip to several offshore reef sites. Long before sunrise, they began loading tanks, fins, spear guns, and other equipment onto a boat for the journey into the Gulf. By mid-morning, they were operating nearly 20 miles from shore. Getting to locations like this takes time. Boats often travel well beyond sight of land before reaching productive waters. I've never been much of a diver myself, but being 18 miles offshore sounds very different from spending an afternoon at a local lake. Once you're out there, everything takes longer when the shoreline is miles away. The group completed several dives throughout the morning. Between dives, they rested on the boat, checked equipment, and discussed where to enter the water next. By early afternoon, they reached another reef site and prepared for another dive. Emily entered the water alongside several other divers. Fish activity had been spotted around sections of the reef, and the group spread out to cover more area. Sometimes, the divers were close together. Other times, parts of the reef briefly blocked their view of one another. Underwater, movement was constant. Divers adjusted positions, changed direction, and maneuvered around rock formations while tracking fish. Emily had moved around one side of the reef when another diver fired at a fish near the reef face. The shaft deflected off the rock and struck her in the upper chest and shoulder, remaining lodged in place. From where the other diver was positioned, Emily was completely out of view. Nearby, divers immediately swam toward her. The injury was severe, but she remained conscious. The shaft remained lodged in place, and every movement had to be controlled. The group's priority became getting her to the surface as carefully as possible. They assisted her upward and guided her back toward the boat. Bringing her aboard proved difficult. Lifting her out of the water required careful coordination to avoid shifting the embedded shaft and worsening the injury. Once Emily was on deck, the seriousness of the situation became clear. Diving gear was pushed aside. Towels, clothing, and available medical supplies were gathered. While the group worked around Emily, one person got on the radio and called for help. The spear could not safely be removed. For the next several minutes, the boat headed directly toward shore. 18 miles suddenly felt much farther away. On land, that might not sound like a long distance. Out on open water, it was time they didn't have. As the vessel moved across open water, everyone on board was focused on the same goal, keeping Emily alive long enough to reach help. Over time, however, her condition deteriorated. Blood loss continued despite efforts to control it. The injury had caused extensive internal damage. The crew continued relaying updates during the return trip while monitoring Emily's condition. The shoreline eventually came into view, but the distance had already taken its toll. By the time the boat approached land, Emily had become unresponsive. Emergency personnel met the vessel upon arrival, but the injuries were too severe. Emily was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Because multiple people witnessed the incident, investigators were able to establish a detailed timeline. Statements from the divers, GPS records from the vessel, communication logs, and examination of the spear gun all helped reconstruct the sequence of events. The examination determined that Emily died from penetrating trauma and internal bleeding caused by the spear gun injury. Investigators found no evidence of equipment malfunction. The case was ruled an accidental diving fatality. It was October 14th, 2018. The desert sun had already climbed high above the sandstone canyons of southern Utah. Towering rock formations lined miles of trails, winding through narrow passages and steep canyon walls. It was a landscape that attracted hikers, photographers, and explorers from across the country. Jeremiah Bishop was 31 years old and worked as a graphic designer. When he wasn't at work, he spent much of his free time outdoors. He enjoyed hiking, exploring unfamiliar places, and documenting his trips with photographs. There's something satisfying about finding a spot most people will never see for themselves. For Jeremiah, places like this were worth the miles it took to reach them. That October morning, Jeremiah set out alone for a day of hiking through a remote canyon system. He carried water, snacks, a camera, and a phone. The route wasn't considered especially difficult, but it passed through areas where large sandstone walls rose hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. Sandstone formations often appear permanent, but they're constantly changing. Wind, rain, temperature swings, and erosion gradually weaken sections of rock over time. By late morning, Jeremiah had already covered several miles. Some of the tallest formations were concentrated near a narrower section where steep sandstone walls rose almost vertically from the ground. Eventually, he stopped near the base of a large sandstone wall. Similar cliffs surrounded much of the route. A short time later, a few small pieces of rock fell from somewhere above. The fragments landed nearby and scattered across the ground. Small Small rockfalls aren't especially unusual in desert canyons. Loose material occasionally breaks free from exposed formations, particularly in areas shaped by erosion. As someone with a healthy fear of large things falling from great heights, that sounds pretty unsettling. God forbid that wasn't the end of it, and unfortunately, it wasn't. After the first fragments fell, Jeremiah raised his camera toward the formation. The light was hitting the wall at a good angle, and the texture of the sandstone made for an interesting shot. He moved a little closer to the base and adjusted his position. A few minutes later, more fragments dropped from higher up. This time, there were more of them. A sharp, cracking sound echoed through the canyon. Moments later, larger fragments began falling from higher up the wall. Dust drifted down from a section of sandstone above. Then, another cracking sound followed, louder than the first. A visible fracture spread across the formation. Within seconds, a massive section of sandstone broke away from the cliff face. The collapse shook the ground and filled the canyon with dust and debris. Visibility disappeared behind a wall of airborne sand and shattered rock as the formation crashed onto the canyon floor. Jeremiah was directly within the collapse zone. He attempted to move as the rockfall began, but there was very little time to react. Large fragments crashed into the ground around him as the wall came apart. Jeremiah was then struck by part of the collapsing sandstone. The collapse continued for several more seconds as additional rock broke apart and crashed down from above. By the time the movement stopped, a large section of the canyon floor had been buried beneath freshly fallen sandstone. Collapse sent a massive cloud of dust through the canyon that could be seen from other sections of the trail. Several hikers witnessed part of the collapse and immediately called for help. Rescuers responded and began working through the debris field, but the injuries Jeremiah sustained during the impact were catastrophic, and survival was impossible. Investigators documented extensive rockfall debris across the area and conducted a geological examination of the formation. Fresh fracture surfaces, break patterns, and instability within the sandstone wall indicated that a large section of the cliff had failed naturally. Jeremiah died from multiple blunt force injuries sustained when the sandstone wall collapsed. Photographs recovered during the investigation helped confirm the timeline of his final hike. The death was ruled accidental. It was May 7, 2016. The Texas sun was already warming an outdoor industrial facility filled with pipes, storage tanks, pumps, and processing equipment. From a distance, the site looked ordinary enough. Workers moved between different sections of the facility as routine operations continued throughout the morning. Dominic Hansen was 44 years old and worked as a maintenance technician. Much of his job involved inspecting equipment, troubleshooting problems, and making repairs when issues were reported. Like many experienced technicians, Dominic understood that small problems could become larger ones if they went unchecked. It's not the sort of job that makes headlines, but many industrial sites wouldn't operate for very long without it. Places like this are built around systems most people never see up close. Miles of piping can run between different pieces of equipment, carrying everything from liquids to industrial gases. That morning, Dominic reported for a normal shift and received a list of maintenance tasks that needed attention. One of them involved equipment located in an outdoor section of the facility. The assignment wasn't considered unusual. By late morning, Dominic made his way toward the area carrying tools and inspection equipment. The section contained interconnected piping and processing equipment that handled industrial gases under pressure. Many industrial gases are difficult to detect without specialized instruments. Depending on the type of gas, visual or odor-based warnings may be limited. Thought the loose rocks in the last story were unsettling, but invisible hazards like this definitely beat that. As Dominic approached the equipment, nothing immediately stood out as unusual. There was no visible damage, no smoke, and no obvious sign that a problem had developed. Somewhere within the system, however, a gas leak had already begun releasing material into the surrounding area. Dominic started his inspection and spent several minutes working through the assignment. Everything seemed normal until he began feeling lightheaded. He paused and steadied himself against part of the equipment. It was already hot outside, and he'd been working through the morning without much of a break. He assumed the heat was catching up with him. Rather than stepping away, he gave himself a moment and continued working through the checklist. A few minutes later, the symptoms worsened. He stopped what he was doing altogether and remained where he was, trying to regain his bearings. Eventually, Dominic started moving away from the equipment. His movements were noticeably unsteady. He stumbled, caught himself, and continued for a few more steps. He didn't get far. After only a short distance, Dominic collapsed onto the ground. Several co-workers noticed something was wrong and started toward him. Before they reached him, however, some began experiencing symptoms of their own, immediately raised concerns that a hazardous gas might be present. Instead of continuing forward, the workers backed away and used site communications to report a possible gas release. Nearby personnel were instructed to avoid the area while emergency responders were dispatched. Specialized crews arrived with gas monitoring equipment and quickly detected dangerous concentrations of toxic gas near the section where Dominic had collapsed. The area was secured while responders worked to reach him safely. By the time specialized crews were able to enter the area, Dominic had already suffered critical toxic exposure. He was eventually brought out of the contaminated section, but the gas had already caused severe damage to his respiratory system and deprived his body of oxygen for too long. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Air monitoring conducted after the incident confirmed hazardous concentrations of toxic gas around the equipment. Investigators identified a leaking valve assembly near the equipment Dominic was inspecting as the source of the release. Gas escaping from the system had accumulated around the worksite before he arrived. The cause of death was determined to be acute toxic gas exposure resulting in respiratory failure. The case was ruled accidental. It was July 18, 2019. Near Yellowstone National Park, steam drifted across a geothermal area where hot water bubbled through mineral-stained ground. The landscape looked almost otherworldly, with rising vapor, bright colors, and geothermal features scattered across the terrain. Rebecca Morgan was 38 years old and enjoyed traveling whenever she had the opportunity. She liked visiting places that felt different from everyday life, especially natural areas shaped by unusual geological forces. Friends knew her as someone who preferred exploring somewhere new over returning to the same destination twice. Geothermal areas certainly offered something different. It's hard to argue with that when the ground is steaming in one direction and bubbling in another. Landscapes like this tend to leave an impression whether you're interested in geology or not. Pools of water can glow with unexpected colors, steam rises from cracks in the earth, and heat escapes from places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. Even standing still, there's a sense that the landscape is constantly changing. That afternoon, Rebecca spent several hours exploring the area and taking photographs. Like many visitors, she moved between different geothermal features, stopping occasionally to admire the scenery or read information about the landscape around her. The terrain varied from place to place. Some sections were rocky, others were covered by thin layers of mineral deposits left behind by years of geothermal activity. From a distance, much of the ground looked solid. That's probably what makes places like this so deceptive. The most dangerous parts don't always look dangerous. Rebecca eventually approached a section of terrain near several smaller geothermal features. The surface appeared dry and firm, blending in with the surrounding area. It looked like a perfectly reasonable place to step. Then the ground beneath Rebecca's feet cracked. At first, it was only a small fracture spreading across the surface. The crust sagged beneath her weight before giving way completely. What looked like solid ground was actually a thin layer of mineral deposits covering a hidden pocket of superheated water and mud. One leg broke through first. Then, a larger section collapsed around the opening. Rebecca lost her footing and fell into the geothermal cavity below. The temperature was extreme. She immediately tried to pull herself free as the edges of the opening continued crumbling around her. Loose sections of crust broke away and fell into the water below, making it difficult to find anything stable to grab onto. The fall lasted only a moment, but the shock was immediate. Rebecca tried to brace herself against the sides of the opening and push upward. Steam rose from the cavity around her as hot water and mud churned below. Several attempts to pull herself out were unsuccessful. The sides of the opening were uneven and fragile, making it difficult to gain leverage. Small sections continued breaking away whenever weight was placed on them. People nearby heard her cries and rushed toward the area. Several stopped short when they saw the condition of the ground surrounding the collapse. One visitor found a section of stable ground close enough to reach her and, with help from another bystander, pulled her free from the opening. Emergency services were contacted immediately and arrived shortly after. Rebecca was transported for emergency treatment. The extent of her injuries became clear almost immediately. Despite extensive medical efforts, she later died from the burns sustained during the incident. After the area could be examined safely, investigators documented the collapse site and the geothermal conditions beneath it. The opening led into a pocket of superheated water concealed below a thin mineral crust that had been unable to support her weight. Rebecca died from severe thermal injuries caused by exposure to the near-boiling geothermal water beneath the surface. The burns affected a large portion of her body and caused severe shock and organ damage. Her death was ruled accidental. It was August 14th, 2016, deep in Brazil's Amazon basin, where brown river water cut through dense jungle during the dry season. A wooden lodge stood roughly 20 feet above the muddy riverbank, surrounded by thick tree cover. The water level during August was unusually low, and that matters because low water means one thing out here. Fish concentrate in smaller pools, competition for food intensifies, and anything that moves near the surface becomes a target. Anyone living near that river already knew this. Zamira Thorne was 27 years old. She worked behind the counter at a small print shop back in Oregon. By most accounts, she was adventurous, outgoing, and driven by a genuine desire to experience things outside her routine. She'd spent close to a year saving for a solo backpacking trip through South America. She wanted something real, something worth talking about when she got home. What she also wanted was content, the kind of footage that makes people stop scrolling. She'd spent the evening filming short clips with two backpackers she'd just met, chasing what she called fearless travel moments. I get it, I really do. The urge to prove you were part of something incredible is really something you can be proud of. But being fearless isn't the same as being reckless. Earlier that afternoon, fishermen upstream had dumped animal scraps into the river. Lodge workers knew immediately what that meant. They spent most of the day warning tourists to stay out of the water, not casually, but repeatedly and specifically. The signs were hard to miss. Violence splashing near the dock, stripped fish carcasses drifting through the reeds, birds circling low overhead. A guide warned Zamira directly not to go near the ladder because piranhas were gathering during the feeding window. Rope barriers were tied across the lower platform entrance. The issue here is that the warning sign was laid out clearly. It just wasn't enough to stop Zamira, who had already made up her mind. A tourist nearby began throwing fish chunks into the river to attract dolphins, and a crowd gathered along the railing with phones out. Zamira removed her sandals, stepped around the rope barrier, and climbed down the dock ladder while staff yelled for her to stop. She was waist-deep in roughly 4 feet of murky brown water, holding her action camera above her head when the bites began. Witnesses described sudden splashing near the ladder moments after the scraps hit the surface about 10 feet away. The strikes across her ankles and calves came fast, not the cinematic swarm from movies, but scattered rapid bites that caused immediate pain. She tried climbing back up. Her foot slipped against algae-covered wood below the waterline. Her shin struck a lower support, and she dropped sideways into deeper water. The fall appeared to briefly disorient her. What followed was a desperate struggle to regain footing in water she could barely see through while bites continued across her legs and feet. Every time she slipped lower, her hands went under and the fish struck at her fingers. A lodge worker used a hooked pole to drag her closer while another beat the water with an oar to scatter the fish. She pulled herself halfway up the ladder before her injured leg gave out and she went back under. Witnesses stated her panicked thrashing made everything significantly worse. Staff eventually got her onto the platform using the pole, and a towel looped around her arm. Her lower legs were covered in dozens of bite wounds, most shallow and irregular, not the catastrophic injuries people might imagine. She was coughing up river water, drifting in and out of consciousness, breathing becoming increasingly shallow. The nearest medical station was only accessible by boat. Responders arrived nearly 40 minutes later. Investigators concluded Zamira died from a mix of drowning, head trauma from the fall, blood loss, and spending too long in the water. The bites were not considered the main cause. Authorities questioned the tourist who threw fish scraps into the river, though no major charges were announced in the days. After the incident, workers installed wooden barriers to block river access. Zamira's body was transported by canoe to a nearby town the next morning. It was September 28, 2018, along the western coast of Sulawesi, where Palu Bay had become a growing destination for international tourists, drawn by its calm waters and affordable beachfront resorts. The resort sat less than 300 feet from the shoreline. Open-air lobbies, glass-panel ocean views, beachfront restaurants. It was designed to put guests as close to the water as possible. Dean Foster, was 38 years old, working a physical maintenance role for a shipping operation back in Arizona. His wife Mary was 35, working at a local care facility. Their 22-year-old son Daniel joined them on what was supposed to be a straightforward family beach vacation, somewhere people specifically traveled to because it felt safe and well managed. There's something particularly hard about this case that I want to be upfront about, because what happened to the Foster family wasn't recklessness in the way we usually talk about on this channel. They were caught inside a moment where information broke down faster than anyone could process it before they ever had a clear chance to make the right call. The earthquake struck that afternoon, strong enough to knock drinks off tables throughout the resort. Staff received fragmented emergency radio messages suggesting possible tsunami activity, but details were unclear and changing minute to minute. The outdoor warning systems never broadcast clear evacuation instructions to guests. Workers near the front desk were overheard trying to confirm whether transport vehicles heading uphill were actually coming. No organized evacuation reached the guests still eating dinner in the beachfront restaurant. Then the ocean pulled back, not gradually, suddenly. Hundreds of feet of exposed wet sand where open water had been minutes before. Daniel walked out across the seafloor, pulling out his phone to record it. Dean followed with his own camera, drawn by something that looked unlike anything he'd seen before. Mary stayed closer to the resort entrance. Witnesses who survived stated she repeatedly urged both of them back as the situation around them started to feel uncertain rather than clearly directed. Some staff were moving inland. Others were still trying to guide guests, and from the outside, it wasn't obvious what the correct response was supposed to be. Dean kept filming. At first, I thought Dean followed Daniel to stop him. What I didn't expect was that instead of holding him back, he joined in, ignoring Mary as she tried to stop them both. Witnesses described a deep, low roaring from beyond the bay entrance. Not a visible wave, but a sound that arrived before anything could be seen. The surge hit the resort's glass beachfront panels with enough force to launch tables, luggage carts, and shattered glass across the entire lobby floor. Dean was struck by debris near the entrance and knocked against a concrete support column as floodwater exploded through the ground floor. Witnesses later found him pinned beneath collapsed wall sections near the restaurant side of the lobby. Investigators concluded he died from traumatic injuries sustained during the initial impact. Daniel disappeared beneath dark, churning water filled with broken furniture and debris. Mary reached the reception counter and attempted pulling him upward through the current when a second surge pushed through a side corridor and swept both of them deeper into the flooded hallway. Survivors on upper floors described the ground level filling completely within minutes. Mary was found beneath collapsed railings near a partially destroyed staircase corridor. Daniel's body was recovered farther inland the following morning. I can't even imagine what Mary was thinking in that moment, fighting the current, reaching for Daniel, and then being swept under herself. If you were in her place, watching someone you love disappear beneath that surge, what would you do? Emergency crews reached the property after debris was cleared from surrounding access roads. Dean and Mary were identified that evening. Investigators confirmed the outdoor tsunami warning system did not deliver a clear, audible alert across the resort during the critical window, and that staff communication during those moments was fragmented and overwhelmed by the speed of events. Authorities concluded all 3 deaths resulted from traumatic injuries and drowning during the surge, with the rapidly developing situation leaving little time for coordinated evacuation to reach everyone. It was November 9, 2015 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, after hours of heavy rain had flooded roads and forced widespread closures. GPS systems began rerouting drivers onto unfamiliar secondary roads, sending some into hillside neighborhoods of narrow alleys and steep passages, areas where invisible territorial boundaries were only understood by locals. Clara Vance was 24 years old. She worked at a small animal grooming shop back in Florida. The kind of job that keeps you busy, pays the basics, and leaves you dreaming about the next trip out. She traveled to Rio with 2 friends for a long tourist weekend, drawn by the energy of the city and everything she'd seen of it online. They rented a compact SUV to move freely between areas without depending on crowded buses or expensive rides. Clara was the kind of traveler who documented everything. Phone out, window down, filming whatever caught her eye as the city moved past. Their navigation app rerouted them uphill after rain blocked their intended road. The alley the GPS pushed them into was narrow enough that the mirrors nearly cleared the walls on both sides. Graffiti marked the concrete in ways that meant something to people who lived there. Burned scooters sat at the edges of the road. Storefront shutters were damaged and pulled down. Residents sheltering beneath tarps along the alley saw the SUV and immediately began gesturing downhill, shouting for the vehicle to turn around. Inside the car, the group interpreted this as harassment, the kind of thing tourists are warned about in unfamiliar cities. They kept moving. Armed lookouts positioned roughly 50 yards farther uphill had already seen the SUV entering the alley. The vehicle was a compact SUV, the same general type used by unmarked units during police operations in the area. That resemblance, in a neighborhood with a long history of unannounced raids, changed everything about how those men interpreted what was coming toward them. One lookout reportedly called out that the vehicle matched the profile of a police SUV. The driver of the rental didn't notice the armed men stepping into the street until the SUV was already deep enough into the alley that reversing required a full turn in a space that barely allowed it. He began trying to turn around. The gunfire started before the vehicle completed the maneuver. Rounds came from farther uphill, and the windshield and side windows shattered within seconds. Clara was sitting in the rear passenger seat with her phone out, filming the alley through the open window, when rounds penetrated the rear door and window beside her. One struck her upper chest. The driver was hit in the shoulder and lost control, sending the SUV sideways into a concrete fruit stand along the alley wall. Market stalls collapsed as residents nearby ran for cover through doorways and up staircases. The vehicle horn jammed after the collision and continued sounding continuously. Additional gunmen farther up the alley briefly opened fire toward the stopped vehicle before the shooting gradually slowed. Witnesses stated the firing stopped once armed lookouts approached the wrecked SUV on foot and saw the passengers inside. Terrified civilians with no police equipment, no weapons, no radios, nothing that matched what they had assumed was coming up that alley. The shooters withdrew uphill through narrow staircases while residents moved toward the vehicle and pulled surviving passengers out onto the wet pavement. Clara had collapsed sideways against the damaged doorframe. She stopped responding before emergency crews could safely enter the neighborhood. I keep thinking about that moment when the residents were waving them back, shouting for them to turn around. What if they hadn't misjudged it? I can't help but wonder if our story would have ended differently. Emergency responders entered the area only after local negotiators secured temporary access. Police documented more than 24 bullet impacts across the exterior of the SUV. Investigators stated the GPS rerouting during the rainstorm was the primary factor that pushed the vehicle into the restricted neighborhood. Clara was pronounced dead shortly after responders removed her from the rear seat. The cause of death was confirmed as a gunshot wound to the upper chest. Local authorities questioned several residents in the area, but released limited public details, citing safety concerns. The rental SUV was removed downhill under police escort by tow truck the following day. Clara's case stays with me because the danger wasn't something you could see coming. It was invisible right up until the moment it was too late. On Tuesday, July 22, 2016, Harris Vogt was walking through Glacier National Park the way he always walked through Glacier National Park. Slow, intentional, filming himself doing it. He was a wildlife buff who'd turned freelance videographer with a reputation and fan base built upon footage daringly perilous. A chest cam mounted his perspective, while the video from a secondary handheld rig rushed in for tighter, more dangerous shots. Standing just off camera was his producer, Dina Marsh, 31. She oversaw operations and logistics for his shoots and, more often than not, served as his voice of reason to how crazy he was willing to push things. They had worked together for 2 years at that point. Familiar partners, they functioned well inside that tension, nearly always disagreeing about where the line was, but accustomed to pushing right up against it. That morning, Glacier was mid-season on one of its worst dry spells in recent memory. By sunrise, the temperature hovered past 80 degrees Fahrenheit, with hardly a whisper of wind. On trails, vegetation grew dry and thick, cracking underfoot and obscuring vision. In bear country, it narrows your margin for both distance and reaction time. Temporary warning signs had been posted at the trailhead that morning after rangers found fresh bear sign, tracks, scat, disturbed vegetation within 300 yards of the path. Harris read it and kept moving. Dina photographed it. A group of hikers had already stopped along the trail, pointing upslope. A sow grizzly with 2 cubs was feeding in the brush above, maybe 150 to 200 yards out. Harris arrived, assessed the scene, and stepped off the trail entirely, moving uphill through the brush. Dina stayed at the trail edge. What passed between them in those few seconds, whether there was an argument, whether he waved her off, no one else was close enough to hear. What other hikers saw was Harris moving uphill and Dina not following. He repositioned several times to eliminate foreground branches from the shot. By the time he settled, witnesses estimated he had closed the distance to roughly 60 feet from the sow. 60 feet! That is not a buffer. That is barely enough space to register what's happening before it's already happening. He held his position while the bear signaled, through every means a grizzly has, that she knew he was there. Audible huffing, then jaw-popping, the sound grizzlies make when they move from annoyed to threatened. Dina, from the trail below, called out for him to back away. Harris didn't move. He was framing the shot, and the sow was framing him. She had 2 cubs behind her and a stranger at 60 feet who wasn't leaving. The charge came without extended warning, out of the brush and closing ground before anyone had time to process it. Witnesses described the distance collapsing in roughly 2 seconds. At 60 feet, that's not a chase, that's an arrival. Harris pivoted downhill while still holding his camera. The slope was loose rock and dry soil that gives way under sudden movement. He lost traction almost immediately and was still going down when the bear reached him. The struggle lasted seconds. High-intensity contact focused on the head and upper torso. The bear disengaged once Harris stopped moving and returned upslope without further pursuit. Dina was still on the trail when it happened. She had watched him go up. She had called out. She was standing there when the brush stopped moving. Rangers and medical responders reached the site, but the injuries were not survivable. Investigators concluded Harris had closed to roughly 60 feet from a sow with cubs and triggered a defensive charge by reducing that margin past what the bear could tolerate. The sow was not relocated or euthanized. Dina Marsh provided a formal statement and left the park the following morning. The park was quiet again within the week. The trail reopened, the signs went back up, and hikers moved through that same stretch like nothing had happened. The place doesn't change. Only the person is gone, and Dina Marsh got to go home carrying every one of those steps with her. Nancy Trawl, 41, had built her entire platform on going where most people stop. Volcano rims, canyon edges, places where the view only sharpens if you're willing to get closer than you should. At Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, she wasn't improvising. She had spent 2 days working the terrain, posting 3 pieces already, each one carefully framed, paced, and edited for impact. The 4th was supposed to be the strongest, the one that made people pause mid-scroll. She was constructing it that morning. She never uploaded it. By then, the park was defined by active volcanic conditions. The crater overlook carried the sharp, chemical bite of sulfur dioxide, heat lifting off the hardened lava in visible waves. Steam pushed through fissures along the rim, and far below, a faint glow pulsed from within the crater. Rangers had installed rope barriers roughly 25 feet back after detecting ground cracking and subsurface voids near the edge. It wasn't a suggestion. It marked where the ground stopped being reliable. From behind it, the angle flattened. The glow disappeared. For most visitors, that was enough. For Nancy, it wasn't. She stepped past the barrier while others stayed behind, some of them already filming the crater itself. On the far side, she moved along a narrow strip of hardened crust between the rope and the rim, following a slightly sloped lip where footing turned uneven. The surface beneath her was fractured, fine, hairline separations where the crust had already begun pulling away. She adjusted her position, leaning forward to clear the angle. The ground failed without transition. The section beneath her gave way along an existing fracture line. No shift, no warning, just separation. She dropped onto the inner slope, striking jagged volcanic rock before the descent took over. The incline, estimated between 30 and 45 degrees, was layered with loose, heat-weakened material that broke apart under pressure. She tried to stop the slide, but there was nothing stable to catch. Rock moved with her. So did dust. Within seconds, she was carried into a dense band of rising steam and volcanic gas, venting along the slope. From above, visibility collapsed. One moment she was there. The next, the steam closed and erased the line of sight. That's the part that holds. The barrier was placed because the ground beyond it had already started to fail. Nancy wasn't careless. She was experienced, used to reading terrain, used to calculating risk. But volcanic crust doesn't give feedback. It doesn't flex or settle. It holds until it doesn't. And when it goes, it all goes at once. The people watching weren't focused on her. They were filming the crater, the glow, the spectacle, until the moment she became part of it. Authorities were alerted immediately. The overlook was cleared, access restricted. Rescue teams evaluated the descent, but conditions made it impossible. Extreme heat, unstable ground, and dangerous concentrations of volcanic gases eliminated any viable approach. Aerial observation traced the fall path, but couldn't penetrate the steam layer to confirm a location. Investigators later confirmed she had crossed the safety barrier and stepped onto unsupported crust over a known void near the active rim. The collapse aligned with the instability that had prompted the barrier in the first place. Recovery was not possible. The overlook remained closed for several days as geological teams reassessed the site, extending barriers and updating hazard warnings. And somewhere, on devices carried out of the park that day, the footage still exists, captured by people who didn't realize what they were recording until it had already happened. May 14, 2015, Grand Canyon Railway Depot overflowed with passengers waiting for the arrival of a train. Visibility was clear, signs were posted, and safety warnings were announced. However, people continued to crowd the platform as the train pulled in. Karen Drunt was 29 years old. She worked in retail and was visiting the city from out of state with 2 friends on a weekend trip. She is easygoing and planner, the friend who books the tickets and handles logistics. This was her brainchild. She'd had her phone out half the morning, snapping pictures of anything and everything memorable. Alongside her on the platform was a father traveling with his young son, maybe 5 or 6 years old, restless the way small children get when something loud and large is about to arrive. The boy had been pressing toward the edge of the crowd the entire time the train was announced. His father had pulled him back twice already. When the locomotive became visible down the track and the horn started sounding, the boy broke from his father's grip and ran straight past the painted safety line toward the incoming train. Karen was closer to the line than she should have been. She was already in motion before most people on the platform had processed what was happening. She crossed the line, reached the boy, and pushed him back hard toward the platform crowd. The child stumbled clear. A bystander caught him. Karen didn't make it back. I've looked at a lot of these cases, and most of them turn on a moment where someone made a choice that served themselves. A better angle, closer shot, one more step toward something they wanted to see. This one doesn't fit that. Karen moved toward the train because a child was in front of it. That's the thing that makes it hardest to categorize, hardest to file away under any clean lesson about risk and consequence. She knew where the line was. She crossed it anyway. The reason just happened to be someone else. The horn was sounding continuously as the locomotive closed in. Standard protocol from the point the engineer identified figures inside the clearance zone. The train had no ability to deviate and no realistic stopping distance at that stage. The front corner of the locomotive struck Karen as the engine reached her position, knocking her off her feet instantly. The impact redirected her downward alongside the train, where brief secondary contact with the ground occurred before the train's momentum carried it past her. The father was on the platform when it happened. His son was alive in a stranger's arms. He had watched Karen move past him toward the line, had seen her reach his boy, and had seen what it cost her. All of that happened in the span of a few seconds. That detail doesn't need elaboration. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Karen was confirmed dead at the scene. The conductor's statement, witness accounts, and physical evidence were all consistent with the sequence of events. The investigation returned a ruling of accidental death. No mechanical fault was identified. The engineer had followed correct protocol throughout. What I find myself coming back to is the father. He went home with his son. He will go home with his son for the rest of his life. And somewhere in that is the specific weight of knowing that someone he never met, whose name he learned after the fact, made a decision in about 2 seconds that he will spend the rest of his life accounting for. That's not a clean thing to carry. It isn't supposed to be. After the incident, safety lines were reviewed and signage updated. By the next day, operations had already returned to normal. Midday, Death Valley was already doing what it does in late winter, temperatures climbing into the mid-80s, a dry heat that pulls moisture out of everything it touches. It was March 18, 2018. Around the park's older mining corridors, the terrain stretched out broken and pale, scattered with the remnants of 1800s extraction, rusted equipment, collapsed timberwork, and tunnel openings carved straight into hillsides, left as they were when operations shut down. Most of those openings are gated or clearly marked. Some aren't. Dixie was 37 years old, and documenting abandoned places was less a hobby and more a dedicated pursuit. She ran an online presence built entirely around forgotten infrastructure, mines, collapsed structures, derelict industrial sites. That morning, she wasn't alone. With her were 2 regular collaborators, Joel Marsh, 34, and Kara Venn, 29. They had a loose system. Dixie shot interiors, Joel handled exterior context, Kara documented from the entrance and managed communication with the surface. It had worked before. It worked right up until it didn't. The tunnel was a partially collapsed remnant of 1800s mining operations, accessible from a point off a marked trail. The interior was low, the walls uneven, the air carrying that specific stillness of enclosed spaces that haven't had meaningful airflow in decades. Joel had stayed outside. Kara had positioned herself just inside the mouth of the tunnel where she could maintain a sight line to both Dixie and the outside. Dixie moved deeper in. Further in, positioned in a shaded recess, was a partially intact wooden crate. The crate contained multiple cylindrical sticks wrapped in deteriorating paper. Some of them were leaking, a glossy, oily residue pooling at the base, consistent with nitroglycerin seepage from aged dynamite. Over decades of heat cycling in Death Valley, the stabilizing compounds break down and the nitroglycerin migrates outward. What's left becomes extraordinarily sensitive to shock, friction, and movement. The sticks in that crate had been sitting in one of the hottest environments on Earth for well over a century. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to. Dixie documented abandoned sites regularly. She understood that these spaces carry risk, but I don't think she recognized what she was looking at. Leaking cylindrical sticks in a mining tunnel don't announce themselves. That gap in recognition is what made this fatal, and the people closest to her were positioned exactly where the system they'd built together had put them. She handled the sticks. At some point, one slipped from her grip and dropped a short distance, striking the edge of the crate and the rock beneath it. That was enough. The detonation was instantaneous. Inside a confined tunnel, the blast force amplified significantly. The shockwave dislodged weakened rock along the ceiling and expelled debris outward through the entrance. Kara, just inside the tunnel mouth, was thrown back by the concussive force and sustained injuries to her arm and shoulder. Joel, outside, was knocked off his feet by the pressure wave. He was conscious when rangers reached him. Hikers on a nearby trail reported hearing a sharp blast and observed a dust plume rising from the hillside. Rangers secured the perimeter, while specialists cleared remaining hazards before any recovery operation could begin. Kara gave her statement from a hospital bed. What investigators reconstructed from their accounts was a sequence neither of them had seen direct. Dixie had been around a bend in the tunnel, out of Kara's sightline, for several minutes before the detonation. The system they'd built to keep each other safe had a gap in it, and the gap was exactly where Dixie was standing. Dixie Plink was confirmed dead as a result of the blast and subsequent structural collapse. The tunnel was secured. The crate and its remaining contents were removed and disposed of by qualified personnel. There are an estimated 500,000 abandoned mine openings across the American West. Most of them have never been fully cleared. Death Valley alone has hundreds. Some of what's left inside them has been sitting there since before anyone currently alive was born. It was August 11, 2016, and Yellowstone National Park was sitting at the height of its summer season. The Norris Geyser Basin drew crowds that day, the way it always does, not just for the scale of it, but for the color. The pools at Norris bleed into shades of blue and green and yellow that don't look real until you're standing in front of them. The air was thick with sulfur. The ground vented steam in slow, steady exhales. And at every turn, posted at eye level and impossible to miss, were warning signs telling visitors to stay on the boardwalk. Fresh off completing her degree, 25-year-old Tally Grix spent the summer moving alone between national parks, supporting the trip with service industry shifts along the way. Friends described her as someone who either committed fully or not at all, and that showed in how she approached each destination, studying the geology, memorizing the history, understanding the terrain before ever setting foot in it. The night before she reached Norris, she set up camp illegally the basin perimeter, choosing a spot she had identified on trail maps, distant enough from the main path to avoid early ranger patrols. Her goal was to reach the pools at first light, ahead of the crowds, before the smell of sunscreen diluted the sulfur-heavy air. She wasn't uninformed about where she was going. What she failed to weigh was how different that landscape becomes in the dark, especially without the barriers and precautions designed to keep visitors from stepping into something they can't survive. She had broken camp before sunrise and was moving toward the pools when the light was still low and flat. The boardwalk was empty. The warning signs were there. She would have passed them. But in the pre-dawn quiet, with no crowds and no rangers and nothing between her and the basin but open ground, the park felt like it was hers. That feeling is the most dangerous thing Yellowstone produces. More dangerous than the heat, more dangerous than the acid, more dangerous than the crust that looks solid until it isn't. Rangers had no record of her presence that morning. No one on the boardwalk had seen her arrive. The first indication that anything had happened came from a pair of early visitors who reached the basin shortly after dawn and noticed a section of disturbed crust roughly 30 feet from the nearest boardwalk edge. A collapsed area roughly 1 to 2 feet wide, with thermal water visible below. They flagged a ranger immediately. What investigators pieced together came entirely from physical evidence. Tally's gear was found at the illegal campsite inside the perimeter. Her trail showed she had approached the pools from an off-path direction, moving across open geothermal crust in low light without the visual reference points the boardwalk provides. A collapsed section of crust, thermal water below, her belongings on one side of the basin, and nothing recoverable on the other. The investigation did not produce a witness account because there was no witness. What happened in the minutes before that crust gave way, nobody saw. What happened after, nobody could reach. This is the part I keep turning over. Tally knew things. She had done the research. She understood the basin better than most visitors who passed through it on a guided tour. But knowledge of a place and permission to move through it without its safety infrastructure are two different things entirely. She didn't wander off the boardwalk because she didn't notice it. She camped inside the perimeter the night before so she could be out there before the boardwalk mattered. That's not carelessness. That's a deliberate plan that treated the park's safety systems as an obstacle rather than the reason anyone gets to walk out of Norris at all. Recovery crews face the same conditions that make Norris dangerous in the first place. Unstable crust, near boiling water, corrosive acidity. A timely recovery was not possible. The area was cordoned off. Rangers noted that the illegal campsite indicated premeditated overnight presence inside a restricted zone, which added a separate dimension to the investigation beyond the thermal incident itself. Tally Grix did not survive. The warning signage at Norris is among the most explicit in the entire park, posted at frequent intervals, written in plain language, impossible to miss from anywhere on the path. Tally had walked past all of it the night before and made camp anyway. That's not the same as not seeing it. That's something harder to explain and harder to sit with. The boardwalks at Yellowstone are not bureaucratic caution. They are the line between ground that will hold you and ground that will not. The crust does not grade on confidence or preparation or intent, and it doesn't care whether anyone is watching. It was May 14, 2017, along the South Kaibab Trail inside Grand Canyon National Park in northern Arizona, where late spring temperatures had already begun climbing across the canyon and the exposed ridge trail received direct sunlight for most of the day as visitors moved steadily along the route, descending from the rim toward the scenic viewpoints carved into the canyon wall. Gray Ploft, a 29-year-old who worked rotating night shifts at a large storage facility, had stopped at the canyon during a road trip through Arizona with two friends. Gray had recently begun recording short travel clips during weekend drives and posting them online. Friends described him as energetic and impulsive, often eager to film quick adventure moments, frequently without considering basic safety precautions. The group arrived at the canyon after seeing photos of the South Kaibab Trail viewpoints circulating online earlier that week. Despite visible warning signs at the trailhead specifically advising proper hiking footwear, Gray stepped onto the trail wearing athletic shorts, a sleeveless shirt, and thin rubber flip-flops purchased at a gas station the previous night. The sandals had flexible foam soles and a narrow strap between the toes, the kind of footwear explicitly warned against in park brochures. Several hikers near the trail entrance noticed the footwear and commented casually as Gray passed, with at least 2 people directly mentioning that flip-flops were a poor choice for the rocky terrain. Gray dismissed the concerns with a wave. In one hand, he carried a small filming stick with a phone attached. In the other, he held a single 16-ounce bottle of water, far below what rangers typically recommend for hiking in the canyon. The group began descending the trail together, occasionally stopping where the canyon opened into wider views. About 0.8 of a mile down the trail, the path angled along a more exposed stretch where loose gravel had collected across the dusty surface. The narrow trail dropped quickly along the canyon wall, and in several places, the outer edge sloped toward steep talus fields that fell away toward lower ledges. As Gray walked, the thin foam soles of his flip-flops repeatedly bent against the uneven ground. Hikers behind him later reported seeing him adjust his balance several times while stepping over gravel patches, stumbling noticeably yet continuing downward without reconsidering his footwear. At one point, Gray turned around and began walking backward while holding the phone out in front of him to capture the canyon rising behind the trail, focusing on the phone screen rather than the trail beneath his feet. The path in that section tilted slightly toward the outer edge where small stones had accumulated. While stepping backward with his eyes fixed on the phone screen, the foam sole of his right flip-flop folded sideways under his foot. His heel slid off the sandal as his weight shifted onto loose gravel. Witnesses reported seeing his foot skid outward as the sandal twisted beneath him. Gray attempted to catch his balance, but his footing gave way near the edge of the trail, the flip-flop offering no grip on the unstable surface. His body slid off the narrow path and onto the steep slope beside it. The loose rocks immediately below shifted under his weight, and he began tumbling down the talus incline. Hikers nearby heard several impacts as he struck rock ledges during the fall. His body traveled roughly 40 to 60 feet before coming to rest on a rocky shelf between 2 outcroppings. People standing along the trail looked down and saw him lying motionless several ledges below. 2 hikers moved up the trail to report the fall, while others remained at the edge to keep sight of his location. After hikers reported the fall at the trailhead, park rangers later arrived and carefully descended the slope toward the ledge where he had come to rest. When they reached the ledge, they confirmed Gray had suffered fatal blunt force trauma consistent with multiple impacts during the fall. Investigators examined the section of trail where witnesses reported the slip occurred. A broken flip-flop was found several feet above the edge along the gravel-covered portion of the path. The foam sole had bent sharply near the strap, consistent with the sandal folding under pressure. It was July 4th, 2015, at Desert View Overlook, along the eastern edge of Grand Canyon National Park in northern Arizona. Late evening temperatures remained in the upper 70s as visitors gathered along the stone observation walls and open rock surfaces overlooking cliffs more than 5,000 feet below. The overlook was crowded with tourists watching the fading daylight settle across the canyon. Among them was 24-year-old Darren Swick. He had traveled from out of state with several friends during the Independence Day weekend. Darren worked at a small vehicle repair shop and was known among friends as outgoing and eager to take part in whatever activity the group was doing. Earlier that afternoon, the group had been driving along the park road, stopping at several viewpoints before eventually reaching Desert View near sunset. While traveling outside the park boundary earlier that day, Darren and his friends stopped at a roadside vendor along a nearby highway. One of them purchased several consumer-grade aerial fireworks, small shells designed to launch from cardboard tubes before exploding in the air. Fireworks are prohibited throughout Grand Canyon National Park. The group kept them with their supplies as they continued driving toward the overlook. By the time darkness began settling across Desert View, many visitors were returning toward the parking area. Darren and his friends walked onto a wide section of exposed rock several yards away from the stone safety wall. According to later statements from the group, Darren suggested setting off one of the fireworks while they were still at the overlook. The aerial shells were designed to be launched from cardboard mortar tubes placed securely on level ground. Instead, Darren positioned the tube upright directly on the bare sandstone surface near where the group was standing. The tube was not buried in soil or braced with rocks. The sandstone beneath it was uneven, with shallow slopes and ridges common to weathered canyon rock. Despite the unstable surface, Darren volunteered to ignite the fuse while the others stepped several feet away. When the fuse burned down to the lift charge, the ignition force pushed against the lightweight cardboard tube. The uneven rock surface caused the tube to tip sideways at the moment the shell fired. Instead of launching upward into the air, the aerial shell shot horizontally across the rock surface toward the group. The device detonated almost immediately after leaving the tube, exploding at ground level only a few feet from where Darren was standing. Visitors across the overlook later reported hearing a sharp explosion echo across the canyon rim. People near the parking area turned toward the sound and saw several individuals moving quickly away from the rock surface, while others ran toward someone lying near the launch point. Fragments from the exploding shell scattered across the surrounding rock. Darren collapsed beside the spot where the firework had detonated. His friends attempted to assist him, while nearby visitors used mobile phones to contact emergency services. Park rangers and emergency responders arrived at the overlook shortly afterward and secured the immediate area. Medical personnel determined that Darren had sustained severe traumatic injuries to the neck and upper airway caused by explosive fragments from the aerial shell. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later documented the debris field and recovered the remaining fireworks from the group. The cardboard launch tube was found lying on its side near the detonation point, consistent with witness accounts describing how the tube had tipped over during ignition. Investigators concluded that the aerial shell detonated at close range after the unstable tube redirected the launch horizontally across the ground, causing fatal injuries from blast force and shrapnel. Fireworks are prohibited throughout Grand Canyon National Park. It was July 2, 2016, along the Bright Angel Trail inside the Grand Canyon. Early summer temperatures had already climbed well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit by midday, and the canyon walls trapped heat along the lower elevations. While the terrain looked clear from above, trails below the rim could quickly disappear once hikers left the maintained routes. Melissa Drisk, a 33-year-old traveler who worked in a creative field that allowed remote assignments, had arrived alone that morning after several weeks visiting parks across the Southwest. She frequently documented landscapes during her trips and had recently read about a viewpoint along the Tonto platform described in an online travel blog. The location appeared reachable from the Bright Angel Trail if a hiker followed a faint path branching away from the maintained route. Melissa carried a small backpack containing a camera, 2 granola bars, and roughly 1 liter of water, far less than what park warnings recommend for summer hikes inside the canyon. She also had no trail map, navigation device, or emergency communication equipment, despite warning signs at the Bright Angel trailhead advising hikers to stay on marked routes and carry multiple liters of water during extreme heat. The Bright Angel Trail descended steadily through exposed rock formations and sparse vegetation. By late morning, Melissa had traveled several miles down the maintained trail. At a bend in the trail overlooking a broad desert shelf, she left the established route and followed a faint foot track leading east across the Tonto platform. At first, the path appeared clear enough to follow. The ground consisted of packed dust, scattered stones, and shallow washes carved by occasional rain. However, the track gradually faded as it crossed areas where wind and erosion erased footprints. Several similar-looking paths branched through low shrubs and rocky ridges. Without markers or prominent landmarks, the terrain became difficult to navigate. By early afternoon, temperatures across the exposed plateau exceeded 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground radiated heat, and shade was limited to small rock overhangs and short desert bushes. Evidence later documented through footprints suggested Melissa moved several miles across the plateau, attempting to relocate a recognizable trail. The terrain across the Tonto platform is uneven and broken by shallow ravines, forcing frequent detours. Investigators later concluded Melissa likely became disoriented as the faint tracks she followed gradually disappeared into similar terrain. At some point that afternoon, Melissa exhausted the water in her backpack. Footprint patterns discovered later suggested she continued moving intermittently between scattered patches of shade, occasionally stopping beneath rock ledges or shrubs. Over the next 2 days, temperatures inside the canyon remained above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours. Without water, dehydration develops rapidly under those conditions. Tracks discovered during the search indicated shorter movement distances over time before eventually stopping near a dry wash surrounded by scattered rocks, roughly 4 miles from the nearest maintained trail. Melissa's vehicle remained parked near the Bright Angel trailhead overnight. When it remained there the following day without activity, park staff initiated a search of nearby trails. Search teams working the plateau located a sequence of footprints crossing the dusty terrain east of the Bright Angel corridor. Following those tracks eventually led them to Melissa's body beside the dry wash. Her backpack was found nearby containing the camera, empty water container, and uneaten granola bars. Investigators documented the absence of navigation equipment or additional water supplies. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was severe dehydration and heat exposure. Environmental records confirmed temperatures in that part of the canyon had remained above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the time she was missing. Investigators concluded the incident began when Melissa left the established trail and became lost across the unmarked terrain of the Tonto platform. With limited water and no navigation equipment, the extreme desert heat quickly turned a short off-trail detour into a fatal situation. Park officials later reminded visitors to remain on marked trails and carry adequate water when hiking inside the canyon. It was April 21st, 2018, in the backcountry along the Hermit Trail area of the Grand Canyon in northern Arizona. Spring weather had settled across the canyon plateau. Temperatures hovered in the low 70s, and the dry trail wound through steep switchbacks and exposed slopes where reliable water sources were scarce. 41-year-old Kevin Blate had arrived earlier that day, planning to hike several miles down the trail and camp overnight before returning the next morning. Kevin worked as a maintenance technician and had recently begun taking longer desert hikes during his free time. Although comfortable working with tools and equipment, he had limited experience with extended backcountry travel. Before the trip, Kevin had read online that small amounts of household bleach could be used in emergencies to disinfect untreated water. Instead of carrying a water filter or purification tablets, equipment commonly used by experienced hikers, he brought a plastic squeeze bottle filled with concentrated bleach. Without measuring tools or clear instructions, the plan depended entirely on guessing the correct amount. Earlier that afternoon, Kevin collected water from a shallow drainage channel near the trail. The water was cloudy and carried sediment from recent runoff, but small pools like this were sometimes used by hikers when no other sources were available. After reaching a small clearing beside the trail where he planned to camp, Kevin poured the untreated water into a container he carried for drinking and attempted to disinfect it using the bottle of household bleach he had brought with him. Without measuring tools, he estimated the amount by squeezing the bottle directly into the water, adding several heavy squeezes instead of the few carefully measured drops normally recommended for emergency purification. The mixture quickly produced a strong chlorine odor around the campsite, yet the treated water was consumed shortly afterward. Within minutes, Kevin began experiencing severe irritation in his throat and stomach as the concentrated bleach solution caused chemical burns inside his mouth and digestive tract, followed quickly by nausea. Hikers traveling along the trail corridor later reported hearing faint coughing and repeated retching sounds echoing up from a campsite somewhere below the trail that evening. The noises continued for some time before gradually fading, but none of the hikers were able to locate the source in the fading light. Evidence later documented at the campsite suggested Kevin remained severely ill for an extended period. The ground around the tent showed signs of repeated vomiting, and the drinking container sat nearby beside the squeeze bottle containing the bleach solution. At some point during the night, Kevin collapsed beside the campsite. The following morning, hikers passing through the same stretch of trail noticed a man lying motionless near the tent and alerted park rangers working in the area. Responders reached the campsite and confirmed that Kevin Blate was deceased. Investigators photographed the scene and recovered the squeeze bottle containing the remaining bleach, while the drinking container still held traces of the heavily concentrated mixture. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be complications from bleach ingestion combined with severe dehydration caused by repeated vomiting and fluid loss. Investigators concluded the fatality resulted from the improper use of concentrated household bleach as a water purification method. Emergency purification methods typically require only a few carefully measured drops of diluted bleach in a large container of water. Instead, Kevin had estimated the amount by squeezing concentrated bleach directly into his drinking supply. Rangers later noted that most backcountry hikers carry simple filtration systems or purification tablets when treating untreated water sources, equipment specifically intended to prevent mistakes like this. It was September 9th, 2018, along the Colorado River deep inside the Grand Canyon in northern Arizona. Late summer temperatures hovered in the upper 80s as rafting groups moved steadily through the canyon corridor toward one of the river's most dangerous rapids. One of the most powerful rapids on this stretch of river is Lava Falls Rapid at River Mile 179. Formed by debris from an ancient lava flow that partially blocked the river, the rapid creates towering standing waves and violent hydraulics capable of pulling swimmers beneath the surface. Among the passengers traveling through the canyon that day was 36-year-old Ruby Grant. She had joined several friends on a multi-day rafting trip organized by a small, private outfitter. Ruby worked in the service industry and had little experience with whitewater rafting, but she often described herself as a confident swimmer and had spent much of the earlier trip moving freely around the raft while the group passed through smaller rapids. Before reaching Lava Falls, the river guide brought the rafts to shore along a gravel bar downstream from the rapid to review safety procedures. Passengers were instructed to tighten their life jackets, secure their helmets, and remain seated as the rafts entered the main hydraulic waves. Witnesses later stated that most passengers checked their gear carefully before returning to the water. Ruby removed her life jacket before the rafts pushed back into the current. Several passengers later recalled noticing she was no longer wearing it as the raft began drifting toward the entrance channel, where the current accelerated toward the rapid. Within minutes, the rafts were approaching Lava Falls. As the raft entered the rapid, the river dropped sharply over submerged rock ledges, forming powerful standing waves across the channel. The boat rose and dipped as it crossed the first set of waves, the current pushing the raft deeper into the turbulent water. Near the center of the rapid, a larger standing wave struck the side of the raft and lifted the bow upward. Witnesses reported that Ruby lost her balance as the boat tilted and was thrown over the side into the fast-moving river. The water inside the rapid churned violently around a powerful hydraulic, where collapsing waves forced swimmers back beneath the surface. Without a life jacket to keep her afloat, Ruby struggled to stay above the turbulent current as the river pushed her toward the recirculating water below the wave. Passengers in the raft reported seeing her surface briefly before being pulled back beneath the churning water. The current carried the raft farther downstream before the crew could maneuver back upstream, leaving Ruby trapped in the hydraulic zone where the river repeatedly folded back on itself. After several moments, her body drifted out of the turbulent water and into a calmer stretch below the rapid. Witnesses reported she was no longer moving. The rafting crew steered their boats toward the calmer channel and pulled Ruby from the water onto a gravel shoreline below the rapid. Passengers assisted the guide as they attempted resuscitation while waiting for help further downstream. Rangers later met the rafting party at a common river stop used by rafting groups traveling through the canyon. Investigators collected witness statements and examined the safety equipment carried by the group. According to the official incident report, Ruby had not been wearing a life jacket when the raft entered Lava Falls Rapid. Without flotation support, the powerful current quickly forced her beneath the surface after she fell into the hydraulic. Medical findings later confirmed that Ruby Grant died from drowning during the rafting incident at Lava Falls Rapid. Investigators concluded that the absence of a life jacket played a critical role in preventing her from remaining afloat in the turbulent water, an avoidable decision that turned a routine passage through one of the canyon's most dangerous rapids into a fatal accident. It was June 3rd, 2015, at a sandstone overlook in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey. Morning light stretched across the volcanic landscape as the first tourists began arriving at the ridge viewpoint. The viewing area stood roughly 200 feet above the valley floor, where centuries of wind and water had carved the soft volcanic rock into tall stone formations and cave dwellings. Martin Osei, a 34-year-old freelance photographer from Accra, Ghana, had been traveling solo across Turkey for 2 weeks, documenting landscapes for stock photo platforms. Friends back home knew him as methodical and detail-oriented, someone who researched locations thoroughly and planned shots carefully. That morning, he arrived at the overlook around 8:20 a.m., well before the main tourist crowds descended on the site. The official viewing area was marked by a low rope barrier positioned roughly 6 feet back from the ridge edge. The small warning sign near the barrier was primarily in Turkish, with limited English text. Beyond the rope, a narrow footpath worn into the rock showed where previous visitors had stepped past the boundary for better photo angles. What Martin couldn't see from the viewing area were the shallow cracks running parallel to the cliff face, roughly 2 feet from the outer edge. The previous week had brought unusually heavy rainfall to the region, the kind that saturates the soft volcanic rock and weakens the subsurface layers that hold the ridges together. Local guides later noted that no formal inspection of the overlook had been conducted following the rainfall. And here's what gets me about this case. Martin wasn't some reckless tourist taking selfies. This was a professional photographer who made his living capturing landscapes. He understood composition. He understood shot risk assessment. But sometimes even the most careful people can't account for invisible dangers. For 20 minutes, Martin photographed the valley from behind the barrier, capturing wide shots of the stone formations and cave churches carved into the distant cliffs. The morning light was perfect, but the rope limited his angles. At 8:44 a.m., he stepped past the barrier and positioned himself on the narrow ledge beyond the official boundary, seeking a wider perspective for his final shots. 2 German tourists arriving at the overlook later told investigators they watched Martin standing motionless at the edge for less than a minute. He appeared focused on adjusting his camera settings while the morning breeze moved across the ridge. Then, without any audible warning, the ledge beneath his feet gave way. The outer section of the sandstone shelf, approximately 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, separated from the ridge in a single clean break. The fracture line followed the existing erosion cracks that had been invisible from above. Martin fell with the collapsed section, dropping 200 feet to the valley floor below. The German tourists reported hearing no outcry before the impact. Local emergency services reached the valley floor by 10:15 a.m., using a service road that wound through the lower elevations. Martin was found partially beneath the fallen sandstone blocks, his camera still hanging from its strap, shattered from the impact. The medical examiner later documented fatal crush injuries to the chest and head caused by the weight of the collapsed rock section. I'll be honest, what haunts me about this story is that Martin did everything he could do. I mean, he researched the location, he got there early enough, and he even spent time shooting from a safe area. It's what any wise person would do. I guess sometimes the margin between a great shot and a fatal mistake is just a couple inches of stone. It was August 22, 2016, at a geothermal hot spring site in western Iceland. Early morning mist rose from one of Europe's most powerful geothermal sites, where nearly 50 gallons of boiling water erupted from the ground every second. Steam clouds drifted across the landscape as the main thermal pool bubbled at temperatures hot enough to cook an egg in seconds. Soren Madsen, a 27-year-old geology student from Copenhagen, had arrived well before the facility opened to regular visitors at 9 a.m. He was 3 weeks into a solo research trip across Iceland, documenting geothermal features for his graduate studies. Soren understood the science behind hot springs and geysers from his university coursework, but his actual fieldwork experience was limited. This was a problem. Now, I've always found it interesting how a bit of knowledge can make people feel a little too confident. Soren knew the theory behind geothermal systems better than most tourists, but of course, theory and real-world experience are two very different things. The main thermal pool and its network of channels were enclosed within a marked visitor boundary, complete with warning signs and protective fencing. But Soren didn't want to wait for the official opening time. A gap in the perimeter fencing, caused by a fence post that had shifted during spring ground movement, allowed access to the outer buffer zone, where secondary overflow channels carried superheated water away from the main pool. Soren squeezed through the gap and followed a gravel service path toward the overflow channels. The ground around him looked deceptively safe. A thin mineral crust had formed over sections of the area, creating what appeared to be solid, dry ground, similar to packed gravel. What he couldn't see was that this pale gray crust was only a few inches thick, covering shallow channels of superheated water flowing directly beneath. Ground temperature monitoring equipment later showed surface readings averaging 200 degrees Fahrenheit that morning, hot enough to cause severe burns within seconds of contact. But the mineral crust made the danger invisible, creating a false sense of security for anyone walking in the area. For about 15 minutes, Soren photographed the overflow channels from the relative safety of the gravel path. The steam and mineral formations made for impressive shots, and he gradually moved closer to get better angles. At some point, he stepped off the gravel path and onto the mineral-crusted ground to position his camera closer to the nearest channel edge. No witnesses were present to see what happened next. Investigators had to reconstruct the sequence from physical evidence alone. Boot impressions in the soft mineral crust showed 3 distinct steps away from the gravel path toward the channel edge. The 4th impression was significantly deeper and asymmetrical, indicating a sudden shift in body weight as the ground gave way beneath him. The crust in that section was less than an inch thick over a shallow channel of superheated water flowing directly underneath. When it collapsed, the opening measured roughly 16 inches across, large enough for a person's leg to break through into the scalding water below. Drag marks and disturbed mineral deposits around the breach point showed that Soren had tried desperately to pull himself back toward the service path. Facility staff found him at 8:55 a.m. during their routine pre-opening safety checks. His lower body had broken through the crust into the channel beneath, where water temperatures reached 206 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal injuries to his lower torso and legs were extensive and immediately fatal. He was unresponsive when discovered. Emergency services arrived at 9:34 a.m., but there was nothing they could do. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as fatal thermal injuries consistent with immersion in superheated water, complicated by neurogenic shock, the body's catastrophic response to extreme trauma. And I don't know, stories like this always get to me a bit. It's never the big risks. It's those small decisions like stepping a little too far or thinking you'll be fine just this once. It was February 14th, 2018, in the misty cloud forest of central Costa Rica. Valentine's Day brought couples and adventure seekers to the canopy zipline operations crisscrossing the forest valleys. One private company ran 8 lines across a canyon system, with the longest span stretching nearly 1,600 feet through the treetops. Caleb Hutchins had arrived with his wife for their 10-day anniversary trip. Friends back home knew Caleb as enthusiastic about outdoor activities, though he had never tried ziplining before. At 260 pounds, he was moderately overweight, a detail that would prove crucial to what happened next. The company technically required riders over 240 pounds to be weighed, but during busy hours, staff just guessed their weight. When Caleb approached the equipment desk, the staff member glanced at him briefly before issuing a standard adult harness without asking his weight or taking any measurements. The company kept reinforced heavy-load harnesses on site for riders approaching the weight limit, but Caleb was issued standard equipment. I don't even want to talk about how careless that was. The group of 11 tourists completed the first 6 lines without any problems. Then they reached line 7, a 1,280-foot descent across an open canyon section with a 180-foot elevation drop. This line used a trolley assembly with a fixed braking mechanism at the landing platform, where a guide operated a hand-controlled friction brake to slow incoming riders during the final 100 feet. The pre-departure inspection of the trolley assembly was conducted by a junior staff member with only 4 months of experience. Yes, just 4 months. What he missed during his brief visual check was a hairline fracture in the primary trolley wheel housing. The crack was visible under close inspection, but easy to overlook during a quick safety routine. Investigators later determined the fracture had been present for 2 to 3 weeks, yet no one saw it. At 2:17 p.m., Caleb launched from the departure platform. His combined weight with equipment placed additional stress on the already compromised trolley housing. For the first 650 feet, everything seemed normal as he picked up speed along the cable. Then, the stress of his weight caused the fracture to spread. Now here's where it really got me. Witnesses on the departure platform heard a sharp, metallic crack, followed by a change in the trolley's sound as it moved along the cable. The partial separation caused the trolley to tilt sideways, creating uneven contact with the cable. Caleb's speed began to drop as the damaged assembly scraped along the steel cable. From that height, it's almost impossible to survive. The guide at the landing platform immediately activated the friction brake when he heard the sound change, but the trolley was already in serious trouble. It reached the final 200 feet of cable in a completely unstable configuration, tilting and jerking as the damaged housing struggled to maintain contact with the cable. Then, the damaged trolley assembly failed completely. Caleb fell from approximately 72 feet above the canyon floor, crashing through the forest canopy below the cable line. The thick branches absorbed some of his momentum, but he struck a secondary branch network about 26 feet above the ground before his body came to rest on the steep forested slope beneath the landing platform. I watched the video and, honestly, I can't even describe how gruesome it was. Ground crew reached the crash site on foot via a service trail at 2:41 p.m. Caleb was found unresponsive with visible trauma to his chest and head. A rescue team with stretcher equipment arrived at 3:28 p.m., but he was already gone. The medical examiner documented multiple rib fractures with internal bleeding, a fractured neck vertebra, and severe head trauma. The cause of death was ruled blunt force trauma from the fall. Costa Rican tourism authorities immediately suspended the operation's license, pending a full mechanical inspection of all equipment. It was May 14th, 2017, along the upstream stretch of Niagara Falls on the American side. The morning air felt calm, but the wind moved in uneven pulses through the gorge, shifting without warning. The river below looked controlled from a distance, but toward the center channel, it accelerated, feeding everything toward the drop. Paragliding wasn't permitted in that area. The airspace was heavily restricted due to unstable wind conditions and the immediate danger posed by the river below. Lindy Vrack was 29. She worked freelance, filming outdoor content and short clips for online audiences. The kind of person who stayed active, always looking for a shot that felt a little more dynamic than the last. She wasn't reckless, but she was comfortable pushing closer to limits than most people would. Honestly, this is the kind of mindset that feels safe in the moment. You've done similar things before, nothing went wrong, and that slowly builds a confidence that doesn't always match the risk. That morning, she had a friend with her, filming from the ground while she prepared for a short paraglider run. She launched from a grassy stretch upstream, outside the main viewing areas, where foot traffic was minimal that early in the morning. The plan was simple: stay low, follow the river's direction, and get a clean pass for the camera. From where she took off, the falls weren't immediately visible, but the pull of the river was already there. At first, everything looked controlled. She gained lift and settled into a glide around 80 to 100 feet above the ground. For several seconds, her path stayed parallel to the riverbank. Her friend kept filming, tracking her movement as she drifted farther out. Then the shift started. Over the next stretch, she moved gradually toward the middle of the river. It wasn't sudden. It was slow enough that it might not have looked wrong right away. The wind pushed from the side, just enough to change her line. Then, one side of the canopy dipped slightly, uneven lift pulling her offline. Not a full collapse, but enough that her brake input didn't fully correct the turn, and her direction kept shifting toward the center. From that point, the glide stopped being controlled. She adjusted, trying to correct her angle, but the canopy didn't fully respond. It stayed inflated, but her direction kept carrying forward, and at that height, there wasn't much margin to work with. The river below was moving faster now. You can actually see that transition if you've ever stood there. The water smooths out, then starts accelerating. That's exactly where she was heading. I think this is the part people underestimate. It doesn't take a dramatic failure, just a small loss of control in the wrong place. This is one of the most overlooked dangers here, the moment where nothing looks wrong yet, but control is already slipping away. As she neared the brink, the air changed again. The flow over the falls creates instability, updrafts, and downward pull happening at the same time. Her descent rate increased, and whatever control she still had wasn't enough to redirect. She crossed the edge still in the harness. From there, it was a direct drop of roughly 160 feet. The entire drift was captured on video by her friend on the ground, showing her gradual movement toward the center current before she disappeared over the edge. Search crews began working the lower river later that day. They located her downstream after several hours. The injuries documented were consistent with a high-impact fall into water at that height. Investigators reviewed the footage and the conditions the morning. The findings pointed to unstable wind patterns and gradual lateral drift toward the center current. No equipment failure was identified. In the end, it came down to positioning. She didn't start in danger, she drifted into it, a series of small shifts that didn't look serious until there was no room left to recover. It was August 2, 2016, along the upper stretch of Niagara Falls near the Canadian side. The river looked deceptively calm from the shoreline, wide and steady, but the current underneath was already accelerating. The water level was higher than usual, pushing faster toward the drop. From a distance, it didn't look violent yet, but everything was already moving in one direction. Louis Drum was 41. He worked in general labor and spent much of his free time building things, testing ideas, and documenting small stunt attempts. Not professionally, just someone who liked proving something could be done. He wasn't reckless in the usual sense, but he pushed limits a little further each time. This trip wasn't random. He had been planning it, building a barrel he believed could handle the descent. The barrel was wooden, reinforced with metal bands, built in sections and tightened from the outside. It wasn't crude, but it wasn't engineered beyond basic reinforcement. Inside, there was padding, but it was uneven and didn't hold him in place. There were no restraints, nothing to stop his body from shifting once movement started. 2 people with him stayed on shore, filming as he positioned the barrel at the river's edge upstream, keeping their distance from the main areas to avoid attention. From where they launched, the falls weren't immediately visible, but the pull of the current was constant. Even at the edge, the water didn't sit still. It moved forward, slow but steady. Once the barrel entered the river, there was no way to stop or redirect it. At first, the movement looked manageable. The barrel floated upright, drifting with the surface flow. For a short distance, it didn't appear unstable. The camera followed as it moved farther out, slowly getting pulled into stronger water. Then, the rotation started. At first, it was subtle, a slight turn as the current shifted underneath it, but the river wasn't uniform. The current wasn't even, and the barrel reacted to every shift beneath it. It began rotating more noticeably, each turn pulling it off balance. Within seconds, the rotation became constant. The barrel didn't glide. It reacted to every shift beneath it. It picked up speed as it spun, each turn tighter and less controlled. There was no pause anymore. It didn't stabilize. It just kept turning. This is the moment it stops being manageable. From the outside, nothing seems extreme, but the way it's turning tells me I've already lost control. Inside the barrel, every rotation meant impact. Without a harness, his body had nothing to anchor to. Each spin forced him into a different side, back, shoulder, legs, then immediately into another. The padding softened some of it, but not enough to absorb repeated force. There was no pattern to brace against, just continuous motion with no break between collisions. From the shoreline, the change is visible. The barrel stops drifting and starts reacting, accelerating, rotating faster as it's pulled toward the center channel. As it approached the brink, the speed increased again. The surface of the water changed just before the drop, smoothing briefly as everything accelerated forward. The barrel didn't steady. It carried its rotation through that final stretch. Then it tipped forward and disappeared over the edge. The drop that followed was roughly 160 feet. There were no direct witnesses to the impact, but the aftermath filled in what couldn't be seen. When the barrel hit the base, it struck the water with enough force to break apart. The wooden structure gave way on impact, the frame breaking apart as the barrel failed to hold together. He was no longer contained. Debris was recovered first. Fragments of wood and metal scattered downstream. The current spread everything across the lower river. His body was located later in the same area. The injuries were consistent with high-impact trauma combined with structural failure at impact. Investigators examined what remained of the barrel and reviewed the footage. There were no sudden environmental changes, just the river and the limits of the design. The structure couldn't withstand the drop, and the interior offered no stabilization once rotation began. The footage shows how early the movement becomes unstable. Once the barrel starts rotating, it never recovers, only picking up speed as it's carried toward the brink. It was June 9, 2018, in a less trafficked section of the Niagara Falls Gorge. The air moving through that area wasn't constant. It came in waves, steady for a moment, then shifting as it funneled between the rock walls. The river below moved fast but uneven, with sections of smooth surface broken by turbulence where the current hit rock formations. From above, it didn't look chaotic, but the movement never really stopped. What most people nearby didn't realize at the time was that the setup itself wasn't authorized. No permits had been issued for any kind of rigging or performance in that section of the gorge, and the line had been installed illegally, without oversight, inspection, or safety approval. Olivia Gorp was 34. She worked in small, live performances, mostly balance and coordination acts, the kind you'd see at local events or temporary setups. She had experience walking lines, but usually in controlled environments. Lower heights, secured rigs, predictable conditions. This time was different. She wanted something more dramatic, something that would stand out on video. She arrived early with two people who helped her set up the line. They chose a narrower span of the gorge where the distance between rock faces was shorter. The rope was anchored on both sides using portable gear fixed into uneven rock. It held tension, but it wasn't deeply secured into stable ground. Without any formal safety checks or regulated anchoring systems, everything depended entirely on how well those temporary points held. A few bystanders gathered as the setup became visible. Some of them started, recording before she even stepped onto the line. From where she started, the drop below was roughly 100 feet to the river. Not vertical the entire way, there were rock faces and ledges, but there was no safe landing area. She stepped onto the rope with a balancing pole, moving slowly at first. The line held. It dipped slightly under her weight, but that was expected. For the first few steps, everything looked stable. Then the movement started to change. As she got closer to the middle, the rope sagged more noticeably. Not dramatically, but enough to shift her footing. The anchors were holding, but the tension wasn't consistent. The line had a slight give that hadn't been there at the start. I don't notice anything wrong at first, but this is usually where situations like this begin to break down. As her weight centered on the line, one of the anchor points shifted. Not a full release, just a small movement in the rock. But that was enough. The rope dropped several inches instantly. That change shifted her balance forward. The line beneath her feet lost its firmness, turning unstable in a way that couldn't be corrected quickly. She adjusted her stance, trying to regain control, but the slack created uneven movement along the rope. Within seconds, her footing gave out. She fell from the line, dropping toward the rock wall below. Witness recordings captured the fall, showing contact with the side of the gorge before she disappeared into the river. The impact redirected her downward at an angle with no chance to slow or recover. There were no immediate rescue options from that position. The terrain made direct access difficult, and the current below continued moving downstream. Search efforts focused on the lower river area. Several hours later, her body was recovered downstream from the fall site. The injuries documented were consistent with a high fall and impact with rock before entering the water. Investigators examined the setup left, behind. The rope, anchors, and positioning were all reviewed. The conclusion pointed to anchor instability and inadequate securing as the primary cause of failure. Factors made more critical by the absence of permits, professional rigging standards, and any formal safety oversight. Even small shifts in anchor placement can multiply force across the line, especially over spans like this. Without redundancy or load distribution, a single weak point becomes the entire system's failure point. It was April 21st, 2015, along the upper shoreline of Niagara Falls. The weather had warmed just enough for more people to move closer to the water. The rocks near the edge were dark and damp, constantly coated by mist drifting in from the falls. From a distance, the river looked slow and wide, but near the shoreline, the current pulled harder than it appeared, feeding into a faster channel that moved straight toward the drop. Stacy Spive was 26. She worked in a general customer-facing job and had taken the trip as a break from routine. She brought her dog with her, the kind that stayed close but still pulled ahead when something caught its attention. She kept it on a retractable leash, letting it move a few feet in front as they walked along the edge. She stepped beyond the main viewing path onto a section of exposed rock closer to the water. It wasn't blocked off completely, but it was worn smooth from constant moisture. A thin layer of algae covered the surface, subtle, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. Even standing on it, there wasn't an immediate sense of danger. It just felt damp, like any other rock along the shoreline, with nothing about it signaling how little traction it actually provided. From where she stood, the river didn't look dangerous. It looked steady, controlled. The surface moved in a way that felt predictable, without sudden shifts or visible turbulence near the edge. Her dog moved first. It stepped onto a slick patch and lost footing, sliding forward into the shallow edge of the current. The water there wasn't deep, but it moved with enough force to carry anything that couldn't regain balance quickly. There was no splash or violent movement, just a clean, continuous slide into motion. The leash tightened instantly. That pull shifted her weight forward. She tried to brace, but the surface under her feet offered almost no resistance. One step turned into a slide, and within a second, she was pulled down onto the rock and into the water. There wasn't a clear moment where she could stop it, just a gradual loss of control that became irreversible almost immediately. From there, everything accelerated. The shoreline dropped into moving water that fed directly into a stronger channel. She reached toward nearby rock, but the combination of speed and slick surface made it impossible to hold position. The current didn't surge or crash. It stayed low and consistent, which made it harder to recognize how much force it carried. It wasn't chaotic water. It was steady pressure, continuous and directional, keeping anything caught in it moving forward without pause. I keep coming back to that moment. It looks like something that could be corrected, but it isn't. The current doesn't give you time to stabilize or reset. What starts as a small slip becomes full movement almost immediately, with no stable point to recover from. And the longer you're in that motion, the less control you have, until you're no longer reacting. You're just being carried. Witnesses nearby saw her enter the water and move downstream quickly. The distance between where she fell and where the current intensified wasn't far. Within seconds, she and the dog were pulled into the main flow. There was no way back to the shoreline. She was carried toward the brink along a channel that didn't slow or break. The surface smoothed slightly as it approached the edge, almost flattening out, then disappeared over the drop. There was no visible marker of where recovery stopped being possible, just a continuous path that led forward with no interruption. There were no recovery options at that point. Search crews focused on the lower river later that day. Both were located downstream after several hours. The injuries documented were consistent with a fall from height and impact with water at high velocity. Investigators determined the cause as loss of footing on algae-covered rock, combined with leash tension pulling her off balance into fast-moving water. It was September 11th, 2017, along the upper section of Niagara Falls near the Canadian side. The river didn't look aggressive at first. It stretched wide, with long sections of smooth water that gave the impression of control. But underneath that surface, the current was already building speed, pulling everything toward a narrowing channel that fed directly into the falls. Darius Flawn was 38. He worked in a general warehouse job and spent his free time outdoors, usually on the water. He had experience kayaking, mostly on calmer rivers where movement was predictable and recovery was possible. He wasn't new to it, but he also wasn't used to water that didn't give you options. That day, he launched from a point upstream, setting into the river with a helmet-mounted camera recording his run. There was no support team nearby, no one following along the shoreline, just him moving with the current. At the start, everything looked controlled. The kayak tracked straight, cutting through the water cleanly. For a short distance, the surface stayed manageable, with only small ripples breaking the flow. From the camera perspective, it didn't look much different from a standard river run, but that changed gradually. As he moved farther downstream, the current began to build. The water didn't just move forward, it started to pull faster, tightening into a stronger flow. Small rotations formed along the surface, subtle at first, but enough to affect direction. I think this is where people misread situations like this. I personally think experience can give a false sense of control, especially when the environment looks familiar at the start. His strokes continued, but the response started to fade. The kayak no longer reacted the same way. Each attempt to angle toward the side had less effect than the last. Then the spin started. The kayak entered uneven current, starting to turn off line with each correction. It wasn't a full flip, but it was enough to disrupt direction completely. The forward pull didn't stop. It increased. From that point on, the movement wasn't something he could counter. He continued paddling, trying to break out of the current and angle toward the shoreline, but the current overpowered each stroke. The water beneath him was moving faster than anything he could generate. What becomes clear in cases like this is how quickly options disappear. At first, there are choices. Angle left, angle right, slow down. But once the current takes full control, those options stop working one by one. As he approached the brink, the surface changed again. The water smoothed out, flattening as it accelerated forward. That transition point didn't leave room for correction. He was carried over the edge, still inside the kayak. The drop that followed was over 150 feet. There were no direct witnesses to the impact, but the camera footage ended at the brink, confirming the sequence up to that point. Search crews moved into the lower river later that day. The kayak and his body were recovered downstream after several hours. The injuries documented were consistent with a high-impact fall, combined with contact from the kayak during descent. Investigators reviewed the footage and the river conditions. The conclusion pointed to loss of control and accelerating current, with no viable path to exit once he entered the faster channel. I remember a time I was on the water myself. Nothing extreme, just a steady current. But there was a moment where my paddle stopped doing what I expected. I was still moving, still upright, but I could feel that slight delay between action and response, like the river was starting to ignore me. That feeling didn't last long before I got back to calmer water, but it stuck with me. Thinking about this, I can't shake the idea that he might have felt that same shift, just longer, just stronger, until it didn't let go.